Okay, hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Sarah Squire, this is really loud. I'm the founder and principal consultant of Engage Identity, which is an identity and access management consulting firm in Seattle that I started 2 years ago. It's called Engage Identity because I have an unhealthy obsession with Captain Picard, the best captain. My Twitter handle is up here, so you can tweet me questions. We're going to talk today about vectors of trust. So vectors of trust is an informational draft currently winding its way through the Internet Engineering Task Force. My understanding is that it will become a real grown-up RFC sometime this year, depending on how much time we can get John Bradley to siphon off from token binding. So the intent behind vectors of trust is to enable federating parties to communicate a more sophisticated risk analysis than just a single level of assurance. So we're going to start off with a little historical detour, but this does have to do with authentication, so stick with me here, it will make sense eventually. In 2009, there was a contested election in Iran. This was 5 months after the inauguration of Barack Obama. The incumbent Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was very unpopular. Another candidate was favored to win, particularly among younger demographics. His name was Mousavi, and the symbol of his campaign was the color green. When election results came in, they showed that Ahmadinejad, the incumbent president, had won nearly 2/3 of the popular vote. Young people immediately flooded the streets of Tehran, some peaceful, some not. There was a huge amount of police brutality. Iranian media was banned from covering the event. IP addresses of social networking sites were blocked so that eyewitnesses could not post photos and videos to the outside world. But people outside Iran started setting up proxies so that people inside could report the news. I'll give you a minute to read these. These are tweets from eyewitnesses of the event. These people went through proxies and logged in under accounts that didn't use their real name. This sort of login is what we call pseudonymous authentication. Persian Kiwi is a pseudonymous identity. If these people had used their full names, it would have put them in immediate danger of arrest at the very least. The fact that Twitter allowed pseudonyms meant that they were the platform that was used to get this news out to the world. These people would not have used Facebook, which at the time encouraged and expected users to go by their real names. The primary method used to measure authentication in the US, the Electronic Authentication Guidelines, require real names for all measurements above level 1. That document was written with government agencies in mind, not activists or whistleblowers. I want to talk about how we might securely authenticate these people while completely protecting their anonymity. I don't want to know their identity, I want to know their level of security. So first we're going to talk about what it means, what we mean when we say authentication and why we're bothering to measure it. Next we'll talk about NIST Special Publication 863-2, which was the canonical version of the Electronic Authentication Guidelines until literally this morning at this conference. We now live in an 863-3 world, which is much better. Justin and I were co-authors, one of 14 co-authors on that document, now called Digital Identity Guidelines. It was a huge amount of work, but that's another talk. 863-2 is what vectors of trust was built on. So that outlined 4 levels of assurance, so we'll go over those. Then we'll talk about the guts of vectors of trust and how to use it in production. So let's talk about why we measure authentication at all. Why do we do this? Why do we measure security? Well, the National Institute of Standards and Technology is actually part of the Department of Commerce. And they measure things like meters and gallons and kilograms, and they create standards in order to facilitate commerce. If each of you in this room opened a winery and started bottling your own wine and selling it, I would have a difficult time determining the amount of wine I'm purchasing if all the bottles are different sizes. That's bad for commerce. We want a fair playing field. We can't let the free market facilitate the success of the best products if consumers aren't clear on what exactly they're buying. If we set a standard size for a bottle of wine, then consumers can more accurately predict what they're going to get. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology was founded in 1901. They've been doing this for over 100 years, and they've moved past meters and gallons and wine bottles and into the 21st century. Modern companies are selling authentication solutions, and we wanted to create a standard so that consumers of these authentication solutions can compare them. Great. So what is online authentication, and how can we possibly measure it? So I did a project last year to try to help to explain to people who don't work in identity. Do we have any XKCD fans in the room? Yay! Awesome. So Randall Munroe, who draws XKCD, wrote a book called Thing Explainer, which explains complicated objects like the Saturn V rocket using only the 1,000 most common words in the English language. So I went to see him speak in Town Hall in Seattle with an identity colleague of mine. We were drinking beer after the talk and realized, hey, we could do this with identity. It would be awesome. So we did. I put together a whole talk called Identity in 1,000 Words, because 1,000 is not, in fact, in the 1,000 most words in the English language. It's up on YouTube if you want to watch it, and one of the definitions I came up with for that talk was for authentication. So here's authentication in basic English: making sure that a person or thing is the same person or thing you saw last time, which is different from them being who they say they are. That parenthetical is really important. Many systems and standards get built under the assumption that authentication must involve real people's real names. We'll talk more about that later, but for now, let's just concentrate on the fact that we're trying to figure out whether the thing at the end of the wire is the thing we saw last time, that the account hasn't been compromised and there isn't a man in the middle intercepting communication and changing it. So how does that apply to our Iranian eyewitnesses? Well, what happens if their Twitter account is compromised by the Iranian government? It could allow them to post false news from a trusted account. Nothing to see here, everything's fine. Or delete the entire history of the account, the only historical record we have of that event. So we want this account to have a high level of secure authentication, right? So the current version of NIST current as of yesterday version of NIST Special Publication 863, the electronic authentication guidelines were written to help us figure out how much confidence we should have that we're talking to the legitimate owner of an account. They call that confidence judgment levels of assurance. So in order to come up with good levels of assurance, we have to think about the people who aren't the legitimate owners of the account, what they might want to get in, what kind of resources they have, and what they might try to do with the account once it's compromised. We have to do a little bit of threat modeling. So the dog here represents unintentional account compromise. You left your laptop unlocked and your cat walked on your keyboard, or you let your kid play with your phone and they posted some gibberish to Facebook. That's a fairly benign threat if we're talking about Facebook, but if we're talking about a diplomatic cable, maybe not, right? The second attacker is a snooping girlfriend. So this represents someone with access to your physical device, but perhaps not your passwords. Someone who might be able to successfully pull off some knowledge-based authentication. Someone who might not want you to know they were ever in the account. The threatening-looking robot on the right represents bots. Bots don't have physical access to your device, but they are great at brute-forcing passwords. And when they get in, they're probably more interested in sending out spam than anything else. Our next attacker is after money. This usually comes in the form of identity theft. These attackers might be very sophisticated. They will typically employ spear phishing techniques, but they probably don't have access to your devices, and they probably won't leave a trace that they were in your account. Next, we have state actors, nation-states who might want to compromise the accounts of their own citizens or rival nations. Rather than phishing or brute-forcing a password, we can expect attackers like this to have the resources to exploit vulnerabilities in the authentication protocols themselves, to attempt to forge access tokens or set up man-in-the-middle attacks. And finally, we have hacktivists. They'll typically target accounts for political or moral reasons using typical attacks like phishing. So when the authentication guidelines first came out, the intent was to be able to measure how sure we are that the person at the end of the wire is Sarah Squire and not one of these 6 imposters. So as I've said, these guidelines outline 4 levels of assurance. I won't go into the requirements for each one because I want to save time for VOT, but suffice it to say that there's a list of requirements for each level that gets progressively more stringent and protects against more threats more robustly. So let's go back to our eyewitnesses, and let's say that we want a high level of security for them. We want to have very high assurance that this is the same person who logged in last time. We're looking at nation-state attackers, hacktivists, and bots as possible threats. So let's see what's required to lock this account down as thoroughly as possible. LOA 4 requires strong cryptographic authentication. So what do we mean when we say that? So generally, we're talking about how many quote-unquote factors the owner used when they logged in. And by factors, I'm including 3 categories here. Factors can be something you know, like a password, something you have, like a phone, or something you are, like a fingerprint. Or in my case, something you'll get, something you'll forget, something you'll lose, and something you'll get a paper cut A friend of mine also posted to Twitter the other day the Eurythmics 4 factors. I don't know if you've heard of this. They are something that wants to use you, something that wants to get used by you, something that wants to abuse you, and something that wants to be abused. Those didn't make it into this rewrite of 863, but I think I'm starting to wear down Paul Grassi, so you might see them in the next one. So moving on, we want strong man in the middle resistance. We'll talk more about how exactly to accomplish that later on. No bearer tokens. All that means is that if you're sending an assertion across the wire, a notice that says, hey, this really is Sarah Squire, don't write it on a napkin that can be stolen and replayed anywhere. Think of a bearer token like the letters of transit in Casablanca. It can be used by anyone, anywhere, to claim that they are the person represented. That's terrible security. We don't do that at level 4. And then the last thing we need, according to LOA 4, to secure our eyewitnesses' accounts is a government-issued photo ID. This is where we run into a problem. We have no idea who this person is. In fact, we don't want to know who this person is. If we knew who they were, that could and probably would put them in danger. Same for whistleblowers. These guidelines that we've written are perfect for federal government use cases, but they have no way to express some of these edge use cases where identity, who you are, is divorced from authentication, whether you're the same person we saw last time. So fast forward to last year, a draft was introduced at the international standards body called the Internet Engineering Task Force, and that draft was called Vectors of Trust. This document measures authentication differently. Rather than having one scale, low assurance to high assurance, like 863 did, it spells out 4 different scales. So P stands for proofing. This scale measures the robustness of identity proofing, knowing the identity of the person at the other end of the wire. C stands for primary credential usage. This denotes the method or methods of authentication used. This is what we were talking about when we talk about factors. M stands for primary credential management. This is a measurement of how strictly credential rotation, issuance, and revocation is managed within the identity provider. And finally, A stands for assertion presentation. This scale measures how the information, how secure the information was going across the wire, how easy it would be to tamper with the information or impersonate one of the parties in the transaction. So let's start with the identity proofing scale. P0 means that not only was there no proofing, no one knows who this person is, but this person isn't even consistent across sessions. They don't have an account. It's the online equivalent of a dead drop. Anyone can leave things. P1 is what we call self-asserted. This means that the only way you know who I am is because I told you who I am. I'm Satoshi Nakamoto, pleased to meet you. It could be a real name, it could be a pseudonymous identity. The important part is that no one has vetted it. P2 means that you have been vetted to some degree. Doesn't specify whether it's online or in person, which documents were used. This is helpful in an international standard like this that might apply to many countries or entities with different practices. They can determine for themselves what level of vetting they consider to be sufficient for P2. P3 means that you have a quote-unquote binding relationship with the person at the other end of the wire, such as notarized documents or employment records. This is a helpful distinction because it means that there is a potential for legal action if fraud occurs on the account. Next, we'll talk about primary credential usage. This is just a list of what factors were involved in an authentication transaction. So C0 is the same dead drop case that we discussed with P0. No authentication has taken place. No account exists to tie this transaction to any person or any other transaction. This scale is a little bit different. Rather than having levels of high authentication or low authentication, it actually lists the types of authentication that were used during the transaction. And those are represented by lowercase letters. So you might think that it would be any of the 3 factors, right? Something you know, something you have, something you are. But what happens if the user logged in a long time ago and they still have the cookies from that login and they're logging in from a known device and the IDP just lets them in because, well, it probably is the correct user? We wanted to account for those sorts of continuous authentication use cases as well. And those are, in fact, the first 2 in the list. So CA means that session cookies were used to authenticate the user. CB means that a known device was used to authenticate the user, like a phone or a computer that the user has accessed this account from before. CC is what most people in the world think of when they think of login. This is just your standard username and password. CD and CE involve proof of possession. So what this means is that during the authentication transaction, the user was issued a challenge to sign cryptographically, and they successfully signed it, proving that they are in possession of a key that should be known only to the valid user. CF includes hardware tokens like government-issued PIV card or a YubiKey, or a trusted biometric like a fingerprint, or keys generated by a trusted platform module, which is a fancy way to say that you can cryptographically prove possession of a specific device. So I use YubiKeys when I log in. I actually keep mine on my earrings. So this is my CF factor. These are nanos. If you want to log into my GitHub account, you would have to steal my earrings first. So when you communicate this, you communicate all of the factors that were used in the transaction. So if I were logging in with session cookies and a password, the identity provider would use CA and CC. So this allows us to communicate a much more comprehensive data set than if we just indicated whether the user had one or two factors. It also gives the relying party some indication as to what sort of attackers they might be dealing with if they see any suspicious activity on the account. So primary credential management is an indication of how well the organization which is administering the credential practices good hygiene with regard to credential management. MA is what most people are used to. You pick your own password. You never have to reset it if you don't want to. MB indicates that the organization itself issues you a username and password and will allow you to reset it via email if it's forgotten. MC indicates that you have been fully proofed before you were issued a credential, as well as any time you want to change it. It also indicates that if fraud is suspected on the account is suspended. So to put this more broadly, what we're trying to tease out here is how mature the identity provider itself is, how well they follow best practices about deleting older fraudulent accounts, and how strict they are about credential issuance and rotation. So that's M, and then the last one is A, assertion presentation. Assertion presentation includes 4 categories of assertions with different different security properties. So, oh, sorry, I haven't been forwarding these. You want me to go back? Okay. So AA indicates an unsigned bearer identifier, like a session cookie, that could easily be stolen and replayed. A B and a C indicate signed bearer assertions. B is passed through the browser, which could be monkeyed with if you have a malicious browser plugin, possibly installed by a snooping girlfriend. AC is passed directly through a backchannel API, making it less likely that the assertion has been tampered with. AD indicates that the assertion is signed and encrypted, and that it has what we call audience protection, which basically says, hey, I minted this token for Wells Fargo authentication. If someone is trying to use it at Chase, don't let them in, right? So let's try an example to see how this information is actually transmitted across the wire. We'll take each scale and separate them with a dot. So let's say we have a whistleblower logging in. How well is he identity proofed? Well, we haven't identity proofed him. He's an anonymous whistleblower, but he does have a pseudonym and an account that's persistent across sessions, so that's not a P0, that's a P1. How do we indicate his primary credential usage? Let's say he's logging in with his password on a known device. So that would be CB for known device, .cc for the password. We can add as many Cs as we want. If he had used a cryptographic token as well, we would add on a CF. Next, we want to know how strict his identity provider is about credential management. So let's say he's using an identity provider that let him pick his own password and reset it himself. So that would be MA. Now we want to know how assertions about him were presented over the wire. So let's say he's using the OAuth authorization code flow, which passes signed assertions through a back channel. So that's AC. So if I were communicating the strength of this authentication transaction over the wire, I would say it's P1, CB, CC, MA, AC, which, while a mouthful, is vastly more informative than level of assurance 1. It indicates that if this is an attacker, it had a device and a password, so it's more likely to be a state actor than a bot or an identity thief, for example. It helps us tease out which possible threats we're dealing with, which helps us make more informed access management decisions because we're more aware of the risks involved. And the standard does allow you to omit any part of this you don't know, so we could send a vectors of trust compliant message that just said p1.cc, right? This dude has an account, he got his password right, that's all I know. That's perfectly acceptable as well. So I'd like to end with a note saying that this work is very personally important to me. I think it's essential to build out more nuanced ways to describe the technologies we're using so that we can make access management and risk decisions that make sense for the use cases and threat models we care about. The fact that these new documents allow a way for us to authenticate users securely while maintaining their anonymity speaks volumes about the possibilities of the internet and about our values as the technologists who are building it. I encourage you, when you read technical standards and specifications, to question the assumptions that went into them. This work required a lot of people to rethink the way that they conceptualize authentication, and I encourage you to follow their example. Online spaces can allow for more complex standards that accommodate more people, but we have to be willing to question the way things are and rebuild our personal conceptual models. That wraps up my presentation. Thank you so much.
Any questions?
So when you say the user is same as what he was the last time, how do you account for user? Like, are you assuming user will always be in the system?
Sorry, what was the question?
So if you're not checking, like if for identity you're not checking who the user says who he is, and rather checking who he was last time, what if we don't have any information about the last time? Like, are you assuming he'll be always in the system?
I'm not catching the end of the question, I'm sorry.
Like, what happens when the user logs in the first time?
Right.
What if there is no last time?
Oh, a first-time registration? Basically, that's how I would describe the difference between registration and authentication. So if it's the first time you're seeing a user, they're registering rather than authenticating. There is no level 0, so yeah, I mean, it could be no confidence, yeah.
Is anyone using this yet?
No, it is not an
Just
official
proposed.
RFC yet, so I don't think anyone is using it currently. Is that, Justin, do you know of an implementation?
Hi, Justin Richards. So there have been a couple of kind of just test implementations to just like, build syntax parsers and, get the object trees and stuff like that. There aren't, to my knowledge, places that are using this directly. But as we saw in the announcement that Sarah mentioned of 63-3 this morning, 63-3 was very heavily influenced by the discussion around vectors of trust. And we will actually be seeing from NIST in the future sort of more work in that space. And we really think that vectors of trust will be the protocol to carry that kind of information across the wire, because when you have IALs and AALs and FALs as defined in the new 800-63, you need some way to communicate that. And the NIST document doesn't tell you how to do that. But vectors of trust gives you a mechanism for that. And so that's where we think that, the implementation is going to come. So not really yet, apart from a couple of tests, but I think it'll get there.
And we have a question from Twitter, wants to know who is determining the M level, is it self-asserted? Yes, all of these are assertions that are coming from the IDP. So the IDP is telling you how it manages its own credentials. And it can lie, that you have to trust it. Like, that's how federation works.
So Sarah and Justin, with respect to 863 and vectors of trust, is there a one-to-one mapping of the IAL, AAL, FAL into vectors of trust, or is that planned? Because I guess what you were commenting on was about the ability to communicate information about those through vectors of trust, but I'm trying to figure out how we map one to another.
So 63 has no concept of credential management at all. That's probably the biggest, hardest thing to map. There are definitely some things that are similar. Proofing is very different because it has to do with legal binding as opposed to just what kind of in-person or remote proofing has been done. So there are quite a few fundamental differences that would make it very difficult to map. Do you have more?
Yeah, and so in addition to that, there are definitely some differences, but, and you'll see this if you dig into the actual VOT spec. It was written in such a way that you could define your own values and your own categories. It's meant to be sort of a general framework to hang this kind of stuff off of. And NIST is interested in getting involved in defining a different categorization of, you know, like the P levels, the proofing levels, that map exactly to the 63-3 IALs. And so, yeah, that's not there yet because they're written for kind of different use cases. Like Sarah said, there's a little bit more expressivity in the VOT draft than there is in the NIST document, but there will be a future document. Whether it's from NIST or from the iGov working group is another possible place that might do this. That's a little bit up in the air right now, but that future work will align those.
Yeah, so I understand trusting the IDP for some of these assertions. How about the trust of the device? Because a lot of the authentication these days is implemented on the device itself. What kind of protections are there? Is the standard going towards the direction of protecting the vector assertion, vector trust assertion itself in any particular way?
No, we wanted this to be somewhat technology agnostic and to be a document that can live throughout generations of technology without completely falling over. So we decided not to put anything device specific into it. However, I think you could certainly write a profile of the draft that extended the C, the lowercase c letters, that says, you know, this is a rooted phone, or this is a non-rooted phone, or this is a phone that has a passcode on it. You could certainly do that sort of indication of multiple devices and how you describe them.
I meant more from for instance, a biometric authentication or the use of a TPM. I only see that assertion coming from the device environment, not from the IDP. So how would the IDP know that a TPM was used unless you have an assertion that comes from the the device that encloses that TPM?
It does have an assertion from the device.
Okay, so there is an assertion from the device.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I think we better wrap up the
Yeah, I
questions
think
now.
we
We're
gotta-
running short on time. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thanks, everybody.